This is Japan. And it's recently been in the global spotlight as a saving grace, a shimmering beacon of hope to show the rest of the world how to defeat the housing crisis. But why is this so important? Housing is a basic human need, but a lack of affordable housing to buy or rent has been fueling a global housing crisis that only seems to be getting worse. By the global housing crisis, according to the World Economic Forum. In most countries, the cost of housing has grown faster than people's incomes. And in a study of 200 cities globally, more than 90% were found to be unaffordable to live in, with the average home costing more than 3 times the average income. This is a very serious issue. But this doesn't seem to be the case for one city in particular. So how exactly does Japan fit into all of this? Japan is the home of Tokyo, the world's biggest city. Despite facing many of the same pressures of scarce land and a growing population, affordability isn't an issue here. Compared to other major cities like Singapore, Shanghai, New York, and London, property prices and rent rates are still shockingly lower in Tokyo. And unlike many other capital cities around the world, Tokyo is not experiencing a housing shortage. In fact, the city of 14 million people builds much more housing, and much more quickly than other cities are doing. But how does Japan manage to somehow avoid this global housing crisis despite being home to the largest urban city in the world? With a closer look into Japan's housing miracle, it might reveal a dark truth hidden beneath its surface. Is this all really too good to be true? So, what is Japan's secret? What is behind Japan's solution that when it comes to housing, makes Tokyo better than most cities globally, and even against highly developed powerhouses like Singapore, Shanghai, New York, and London? Is there anything the rest of the world can learn and adapt from Japan? If yes, then what? And if no, then why? Is Japan's solution really without its loopholes? Or is the world's largest urban city digging its own grave? Quite literally? This is the secret on how Japan seemingly outsmarted the rest of the world by solving the housing crisis. Stick till the end to find out the dark truth behind it. Tokyo is known as one of the 9 most economically important cities in the world, standing alongside Shanghai, London, Paris, New York, Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, and Beijing. But compared to all of these popular and important cities, Tokyo's rent and housing prices are shockingly cheap. Let's take a look at Tokyo and New York as an example, with the former having a much bigger size compared to New York. According to one study, rent in New York is 440% higher compared to Tokyo, despite Tokyo being much larger. To put things into perspective, in 2023, Tokyo's population was estimated to be around 14 million people. On the other hand, New York City's population is estimated to be only around 8 million people. And this also affects consumer prices, restaurant prices, grocery prices, and even the local purchasing power, in which Tokyo's is higher by 13% compared to New York. So, what could be causing this? Well, it's not due to the population discrepancy between the two. In fact, both of their populations in New York and Tokyo have been rapidly growing at a similar rate over the past few years. So, how does Tokyo still manage to stay cheap despite everything? Does Tokyo have some sort of mysterious advantage? Well, the answer might be more simple than you think. Compared to the 8 cities mentioned before, Tokyo manages to stay much more affordable by simply building more housing, and at a much faster rate than anyone else. But this solution is both simple and complex, and it all boils down to Japanese urban planning, or how Japanese cities are designed in general. And also a little bit of mindset. Stick with us because we're about to dive into each of these. The reason behind Japan's unique urban planning also lies in its relationship with real estate. In fact, did you know that Japan has the highest rates for estate and inheritance tax at 55%? That's 45% higher than the 15% global average, and still 15% higher than it is in the US. If you couple that with the fact that Japan also has the most earthquakes in a year, It makes sense that their urban planning has rapidly evolved to adapt to the situation. If you compare rent anywhere else in the world, you'd end up with some shocking discoveries, like how rent rates have been growing way faster everywhere, but Japan is apparently immune. In Australia, for example, rent is still 128% higher compared to Tokyo. But what's so effective about Japanese urban planning anyway? And what can the rest of the world learn from Japan? Let's revisit the facts. First, Japan is hit with more earthquakes in a year compared to any other country. And second, they hold the highest rate for estate and inheritance tax globally. With both of these factors, the Japanese people have learned to view houses as commodities that are not built to last, rather than a multi-generational investment. This mindset has led to houses in Japan to be smaller, more abundant, and with a shorter lifespan of just 20 to 30 years. In America, comparatively, the average age of a building is 67 years. In fact, house renovations are uncommon in Japan, and instead, the Japanese people find it more efficient to destroy houses that are at the end of their lifespan and rebuild something new in its place. At this point, you might be thinking that this approach is a good idea, and more countries should be able to adapt to what they're doing. But what if we told you that this strategy might not be as good as it seems? Let's take a deeper look at Japan's housing regulations. In Tokyo alone, only 1% of homes are older than 1951. This means that their cycle of building and demolishing houses every 30 years makes sense. As a result, their housing market is much more flexible, and so housing prices are in turn lower. But this abundant supply in housing is only possible because of Japan's housing regulations, or lack thereof. Compared to the rest of the world, Japan's housing regulations are much looser. This means that how the Japanese people use their spaces can be very efficient. But how does this look? Well, their zoning regulations are geared towards prioritizing the bigger picture by providing more access to housing for everyone, which, when all things are considered, is a good thing. When you compare this to how housing is built in the US and other countries as a comparison, they tend to prefer to build single-family homes, which typically have a backyard, a front yard, and even garage spaces. But in Tokyo, mass transportation is so efficient that less people are attracted to buy cars, and thus, parking spaces are less of a priority and not needed or planned into city zoning or construction projects, resulting in more space to build houses and so do not inflate housing prices. Speaking of zoning regulations, Japan's unique approach also encourages mixed-use spaces, which would mean that it's more common, especially in Tokyo, to see houses of different shapes and sizes to accommodate more people. In short, rather than just protecting particular interests of individuals, there's really not much room for people to object to how space is used. While all of this might sound good, there's actually a shocking catch that's mostly unseen by the rest of the world. It's also the reason why Japan's approach to make housing more affordable is difficult to replicate in the rest of the world. Or rather than saying it's difficult, maybe they just can't. So why are cities from all over the world not taking an example out of Tokyo? It actually goes beyond cultural differences, and in fact, there are several reasons why Japan's approach is difficult to replicate in the rest of the world. It's unlikely that other major cities would suddenly start demolishing historic buildings and architecture to give way for mixed-use spaces. From the start, Japan's relationship with real estate developed way differently than it is all over the world, and we see this in their approach. But this change in housing styles is not because of Japan's economic growth, but rather urban expansion. And this is not good. First, such an expansion would mean that raw materials are required for mass production, and in order to mass produce housing, cost is an inevitable factor. And in the process, lower quality materials are used to reduce costs. While Japan was able to accommodate more people, their solution is actually just short-term and has overlooked long-term consequences for their economy. Their build and demolish scheme takes a toll on natural resources. But as people flock towards urban cities like Tokyo, there are several consequences that people might not always see on the surface. First, as people flock towards urban cities like Tokyo, public services are struggling to accommodate everyone. There's also an increased risk of waste management and air pollution, as needs are struggling to be met. And a recent study showed air pollution has cost an estimated 34,000 deaths in Tokyo in 2023. Second, since 2008, abandoned housing in Japan has increased, with approximately 8 million houses being completely empty. And since 2019, approximately 13% of buildings in Japan were vacant. But it also all goes back to Japan's incredibly high tax on estate and inheritance, which is why more and more people are considering temporary housing. After all, who wants to pay 55% tax on a home handed down to them? Lastly, Japan's solution to provide more affordable housing is bad for rural communities there. In fact, their economic activity dies down when people leave for urban cities. And this results in job saturation and overall lack of belongingness for people, as communities change once every 30 years when houses are demolished and new things are built in their place. One study even suggests that this lack of belongingness in a community is one of the factors in increased crime rate. And on top of that, if renting continues to grow as a trend and people are more discouraged to invest in buying homes, this can even impact retirement plans made for Japan's multi-generational workforce in the future. On the surface, Japan's unique approach to tackling the global housing crisis stands out for its effectiveness and efficiency. By consistently building and rebuilding homes, Japan has managed to keep housing prices surprisingly low. However, this strategy is not without its drawbacks and has profound and much graver consequences that Japan might face in the future. But what do you think about Japan's unique approach to housing? Could Japan's model of housing used in Tokyo be effectively adopted in other major cities? Or are there too many logistical and cultural barriers? Considering the challenges Tokyo faces, what alternative strategies do you think could be employed to address the global housing crisis? Let us know what you think in the comments. We really hope you enjoyed this video as much as we enjoyed making it. Please do not hesitate to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for more captivating economic narratives. Thank you for watching, thank you for subscribing, and we'll see you in the next video.